Hello, friends. Welcome back to Trey's Table, a podcast about African American history, politics, and culture. I'm your host, Trey Smith. Today, we are joined by a man whose life has been defined by two of the most demanding disciplines imaginable: the precision of neurosurgery and the soul of a concert violinist. Born in Roxbury, Massachusetts, he climbed from a childhood on the mean streets of Boston to the hallowed halls of Harvard and the high pressure surgical suites. For over 25 years, he served the community of Topeka, Kansas as a leading neurosurgeon, but his journey wasn't just about professional accolades. It was about reconciling the armored identity imposed by history and family expectations with a lifelong search for authentic joy. He's the author of the moving new memoir, Steep, A Black Neurosurgeon's Journey. And please join me in welcoming to the very first special edition of Trey's Table. I'm going to start a new series now called the Trey's Table Book Club, and I'm pleased to announce that our first guest is Dr. Craig Yorke. Dr. Yorke, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a great pleasure, Trey. Good to see you, man.
Good to see you as well. So, folks, what I'd like for all of you to do is just take a moment, and I want you to go to your phones, to your Amazon app or your Barnes and Noble app, and I want you to do the best thing that you're going to do for your intellectual and spiritual life this year. I want you to type in steep novel in Craig Yorke. Yorke is spelled Yorke. In just a moment, given the magical technology that we have today, you should see a copy of the book come up. It has a very unique cover. I want you to order that book for yourself, and I want you to get two copies of the book. One for someone in your age group who's very special, but I also want you to get it for a teenager because this is one of the most amazing books that I have read. I can tell you I've read three great memoirs in my life. The first one was the autobiography of Malcolm X. The second one was My American Journey by Colin Powell. And the third one is the book that's written by our guest today. So, Dr. Yorke, first, let's start off. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself in terms of your background? Where were you born, and what's the beginning of your story?
Well, that's a rare company. I'll try to not disappoint. Yeah, I was born in 1948 in Roxbury. My parents were making plans to adopt as I was born, so I was an unexpected child. I was sickly with asthma, clubfoot, and so forth. My parents were two of the most talented and angry people I've ever known. And they had been significantly wounded by the racial climate, the bigotry in Boston in the 1930s, 1940s. And so they treated their wounds by forging me into their weapon. I was their weapon against the humiliation of their past. And what that meant was that I would for sure become a credit to the race. I would never achieve all that they wanted because their need for validation was limitless. Our family was very tight knit, to say the least. There was a lot of fusion, a lot of surrogacy. Uh, I was really not conscious for a long time of what the project was, um, but I knew that I needed to be a credit to the race and achieve endless success.
How early did you have that expectation? And how early did you realize those expectations were there?
Uh, it it hit home to me the day that I entered seventh grade. My parents had moved into the city limits of Boston from a GI Bill, blue collar, white, ethnic suburb just south and west of Boston. They moved to Boston to enroll me in a school called the Boston Latin School, the oldest public school in the nation. And the first day of the seventh grade, I knew that I had to wear a sport coat and a tie, and I knew that I would have to do that for 6 years. I knew that I would never hear my first name in that building for all that time. At that time, there was no entrance examination for that school. There is now. And in 1972, girls were admitted for the first time. But in 1966, all you needed was a recommendation from your sixth grade teacher. And these weren't ordinary kids. There were a lot of kids coming from desperate families like mine, a lot of Holocaust survivors, a lot of survivors of the potato famine, a lot of desperate folks from post war Italy, China, a few black kids too. But the headmaster stood up and declaimed something in Latin and then, you know, translated it for us. But the next thing he said was, you know, welcome to you 500 boys. I just want to let you know that at the end of the year, we will throw half of you out. Uh, we'll send you to your neighborhood schools, which are more relaxed, because this is serious business. This school is your leg up, and every family knew that. Every kid knew that. My childhood ended that day, and the steep climb, you know, the bunkered existence began.
So let's talk about that. The title of the book is Steep, and you just mentioned the word. And let me tell you why the book had so much resonance for me. And I've actually discussed it with a group of my African American friends. We have a text group called the Black Men Therapy Group.
Ah,
And we are African American men in our 50s who experience something similar to what you talked about. And that is this realization early on that in addition to being a good child, a good student, a good member of the community, you had an additional duty, and that was to be a representative of the race. Can you, and you've hit on it a bit, but is there any way for you to expand and maybe talk about how that manifested in concrete ways on a daily basis? I mean, seventh grade, that's a lot to be told, either explicitly or implicitly, that your achievements aren't just yours, but that they belong to the race. And that you also have to be afraid of failure because any failures that you have will be attributed to the race as well.
yeah, all it's all true. I guess the through line was that you were perpetually inhabiting a hostile space, that the that your world teemed with enemies. And what flowed from that was a kind of loneliness uh, that featured throughout the early decades of my life.
So when you say the loneliness, did you find that you were often doing things alone, maybe not a part of friend groups? For example, did you have a group of reliable friends? I know obviously you and I grew up at a time when there were no texting groups or social media groups, but there were sports teams and things of that nature. Did you find that you lived more of a solo life or did you have any groups that you were part of?
I was very much an only child in every respect. Um, what more to say about that? I don't know. I can say that the word steep is an adjective, and its meaning as an adjective is everywhere in the bookstores. Uh, there are many, many stories of people coming from gritty, tough backgrounds and winding up with NFL contracts or Netflix deals or something like that. What was more interesting to me was the process of steeping, the process of disarmament that began for me in midlife and continues to this moment.
So we'll get into that. Just one final question I could ask you about childhood. So you've talked about obviously this realization of the pressure around seventh grade
Mhm.
and how that contributed to a life which in some ways was quite isolating. Did you feel that for the most part, your childhood really wasn't yours, but rather you were living out your life for your parents rather than for yourself?
Exactly. I mean, that is a theme of the book. I mean, when I talk about the price of success, one of the most important elements of that is the surrogacy, the fusion, the inability to live one's own life. Uh, we talked when I was a kid. People talked with disdain about ancestor worship in primary cultures in China and Africa. But there was a lot of that as I look back on it. There was a lot of reliance on ancestral experience, and that was a big feature of how I went forward. I'll give you one example of the endless success. By the sophomore or junior year in high school, I was running with the fastest crowd in the most competitive school in Boston. And I was doing okay, good grades and stuff. But my parents were perpetually dissatisfied that I was not number one.
Hmm.
And I, I somehow didn't have the psychological equipment to tell them that my competitors were playing for high stakes too. And, I just look back on the guy that sat next to me in mathematics junior year. Uh, we had a quiz in mathematics, and I looked over to see him in tears. He's looking at his result, and the result was 99% on this quiz. That guy was second in our graduating class, I believe. He went on to be a professor of economics at MIT and was shortlisted for a Nobel Prize. So, my parents' ideas were crazy, but they weren't driven by anything rational. They, you know, they were reacting to their own history and were unconscious of it. And so was I.
One thing that I thought about when reading the book and that I wanted to ask you today was this. At what point did you know that you were going to pursue the career path that you eventually pursued? How old were you?
Uh, well, I back up a little bit. Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, his war on poverty, helped me afford to go to Harvard College. And the way that happened was that I got a job cleaning out rat cages in a psychology lab at the Mass General Hospital. And that put me in contact with psychologists and psychiatrists, and it introduced me to the beauty of the nervous system. And that beauty kind of stayed with me. I always wanted to be part of the nervous system. And I wanted to be a psychiatrist because these were the first people I encountered. They really dressed well, they drove great cars, they talked about the great questions that faced humanity. I was just smitten with that. But one of the later laboratory jobs I got, I was across the bench from a neurosurgery resident who said, these psychiatrists are all talk. Come make rounds with me. And his dad was a coal miner from Pennsylvania. He was a tough guy. Anyway, one Saturday morning, we went flying to the operating room to do an exploration of this old man's head. He was in coma as we got to the OR, and my lab mate, Jim, drilled three holes, each about the size of a nickel, strategically placed on the right side of the head. And I'm standing there trying not to faint or throw up. But as he opened the membrane over the brain, what looked like motor oil came rocketing out of the head, 6 inches up. And I'm standing there flummoxed. We get to the recovery room, and this guy wakes up and he starts moving all of his limbs and starts talking and says, damn, I've got such a headache. Where's lunch? And I'm standing there, I'm thinking, these guys can raise the dead. These guys have the right stuff. And so, not knowing anything about what the actual life of a neurosurgeon was, I embarked on the journey.
Wow. That's absolutely incredible. Before that, sometimes kids think, I'd like to grow up to go into the military, or maybe I'd like to do acting or singing. Did you have a planned career path before this incident, which took you on the path that you eventually followed? Or were you just sort of dedicated to being the best student possible?
Well, when I got to college, I saw an opportunity, I thought, to be less of a nerd. I was really pretty much a natural sciences guy, but I wanted to be a writer. And, here I am writing a book many decades later. But I applied to, to be part of a creative writing seminar as a freshman in college. And a couple days after I applied, this is just before the fall semester began in Cambridge, I noticed that one of the other applicants had just published a piece in the New Yorker. And I thought to myself, this is a different crowd I'm playing with. And so I got rejected from that seminar. And then the demands of the Vietnam War came on. And I noticed that people who were pursuing the natural sciences and aiming toward medical school tended to stay in the US, whereas folks who were wanting to be artists or writers seemed to find their way to Southeast Asia. So I was kind of aimed toward continuing to be a nerd and be in the natural sciences. Although I will say this, since I left the OR and since I stopped doing neurosurgery, I don't read a lot of neurosurgical journals anymore. I read history, I read poetry, I read the stuff that I love.
When did you start reading for pleasure? As a child, high school, college?
College,
And
yeah, I
what,
read for pleasure in college. I did.
okay, what types of books?
Oh, I read poetry, I read novels, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X. I read liberation theology at that time. Um, I read science fiction. I read Dune like 3 or 4 times. I was a big Tolkien fan. Uh, James Baldwin was you know, so I read widely.
So, obviously, knowing that you're a man who's accomplished a lot academically, what was that feeling like the day when you walked across the stage when you got your undergraduate degree? Because I'm certain, African American man, prestigious institution.
Oh
What's
my
the
goodness.
feeling? What was that like? I mean, what was that like for you and your family?
I don't know quite how to answer that. Having read the book, you know what my answer is.
Right.
Uh, our graduation blew up. There was no walking across the stage. A group of socialist, progressive labor folks from Central Square basically invaded Harvard Yard and just canceled the ceremony. They threw the honorary degree recipients off the stage and demanded that Harvard not be a slumlord. And, you know, my parents were, my dad was particularly enraged because it was his moment of fruition. We're sitting there in Harvard Yard. Our backs are to Widener Library. We're facing Memorial Church. Um, it was in a way a great metaphor. You think you're gliding down the highway. You think that you're about to achieve something great, and in fact, things just kind of slide away.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that had resonance for me because my graduation year, we didn't have anything that extreme, but it was in 1991 when President George Herbert Walker Bush was president. And just a few weeks earlier, he'd vetoed some amendments to the Civil Rights Bill.
Mm,
And so we had a lot of drama at our graduation ceremony as well.
hmm.
And, that stuck with me because, African Americans, college graduations, frankly, any type of graduations are significant events for everyone, but for us in particular,
Oh
given the
yeah,
history of this nation, denial of education,
yeah.
it's
Hmm.
special and unique. So, I recall reading that, and that's why, wanted to ask you that for the readers because your life has been marked by these events that are so timely,
Yeah,
that
yeah,
really reflect what was going on at the time.
yeah,
But you obviously got the degree.
yeah,
And what was the feeling? Because, hey, for an African American man to have that degree, that's considered to be the pinnacle of achievement, right? I mean, I think there's this belief that if you're a black man and you have that Ivy League degree, guess what? Your life is set
yeah,
forever.
yeah.
But how did you feel when you actually held it in your hands?
Well, because of the family of origin, I didn't feel much at all because we were always living in the future. We did not manage to appreciate the present.
Mm.
And that's part of the steeping that I'm trying to do later in life. Uh, the graduation blew up. I was headed to Scotland to do a Scottish Rite Fellowship in neurochemistry, getting ready to go to medical school, getting ready to climb the next rung on the steep ladder of unending, you know, success. It did not feel like fruition. I think even had that demonstration not occurred, you know, it was always looking ahead, looking to achieve more and more and more, looking to know more and more and more about less and less and less, getting to be more and more an expert. That was the that was the driving force.
When did you first pick up a violin?
My parents started me on the violin when I was 6. I wanted no part of it, and my opinion was completely irrelevant.
Right.
It was part of the larger project of being less easy to despise, you know, whiter, if you will,
Right.
uh, to to learn something that was hard that most people didn't learn, you know, and I gradually got better and better. I didn't believe it was happening, but it was, and I peaked early at 17, playing this concerto with the Boston Pops. But I'll say that the next year I stopped practicing. I played some, I had a union card and played a little bit in Boston in pit orchestras. But basically, I put the fiddle away for 35 years.
So, folks, for those of you who are listening, you get a chance now just to see one of the more amazing qualities of Dr. York, how humble he is. Oh, I performed with the Boston Pops. Dr. York, that's that's quite an accomplishment to play with the
Yeah,
Boston Pops. I mean, you weren't just playing, you weren't just good. You have
yeah,
to be really good. I did some
yeah,
research on this. You have to be quite good.
yeah.
Why do you think you chose medicine over music?
Well, that performance that night in Symphony Hall with the Pops, I remember walking out onto the stage. I remember Arthur Fiedler giving me an amazingly insincere smile. I remember seeing a lot of flowers behind him and looking out at the 2,000 or so people in Symphony Hall. And then the next thing I remember is being told backstage that I had done a good job. So it was a complete out of body experience. It was unnerving. And as that was happening, my teacher told me, a very severe guy, he said, you know, you can make a living playing the violin, but I'm told that you've got some academic chops too. You're not a great violinist, you're a good violinist. You might want to pursue the academic stuff over the rat race of trying to make a living playing the fiddle.
And so at that point, Was the calculus, well, let me follow what is practical as opposed to following what could potentially be a passion? Or was there something about the possibility of neurosurgery that attracted you?
Um, I didn't have a lot of passion for the fiddle. I wanted to play well. I really, really, really wanted to play well. And if anything, I tried too hard to do that. I've learned that late in life, that trying less hard gives better results. But I thought that I didn't want to go to Harvard also. I wanted to leave home, I wanted to go to Swarthmore. Um, but like I said in the book, the letter from Harvard landed with decisive weight in our mailbox. Uh, my parents couldn't conceive of not going there. They said, if you go to Swarthmore, you're going to be explaining to people the rest of your life where you went to college. You'll short circuit that if you go to Harvard. I mean, you just end the conversation, when you say where you went to college. But I did value the liberal arts education. And really, it was an education. It led me away from the bunker that I had lived in middle school and high school. So I was
Well,
grateful for that.
what was your favorite class from that time?
Um, Two of them, actually. Art history.
Mm.
I never understood how abstract art came to be.
Hmm.
And the art history course taught me that. And I had always been uncomfortable going to big museums. But after that course, and right now, you know, museums are a thrill for me. They were a duty. They were intimidating, but now
Hmm.
they're not. And the other course was the history of East Asia,
Mm.
about which I knew absolutely nothing when I enrolled in college. And when I got done with that, I had a real understanding of a part of the world that is increasingly important.
Sounds fascinating. Question for you. Neurosurgery. How long does it take to become a neurosurgeon? You graduate from college, and then how many years do you have to study?
Yeah, you do 4 years of medical school. And then when I was involved, you did a year of surgical internship. So you explored all kinds of surgical disciplines, OBGYN, orthopedics, all that. And then you did 5 years of neurosurgery. So 6 years. You kind of hatch when you're about 30 or 31 if you haven't taken time off.
What is something about neurosurgery that most people don't know or would be surprised to find out?
Um, I would say that a lot of people who become neurosurgeons are like me in that they enter the field with something to prove. They're trying to prove how committed they are, how dexterous, and how much endurance they've got. So there's that. There's also what I think many patients come to understand pretty quickly, and that's that the selection process for neurosurgical residents doesn't include emotional intelligence. I mean, folks are selected for what their left brain can do. That may have changed now. I mean, I've been out of the game for a while, but neurosurgeons tend to be a little short on empathy. Uh, I guess the other thing to say is that neurosurgeons are not shamans, they're not gods. And sometimes I notice that patients and families saw the technology, saw the promotion of the field, saw the the newness of the field. I mean, it didn't exist until 1905, 1910. So it's pretty brand new. So there's a lot of hope that my family member will live forever, that there's always another procedure, there's another alternative, there's another technology that can be a counterexample to to more traditional faiths.
Now, for those who haven't read the book yet, can you give us the time frame of when you were in medical school? What years?
I enrolled in 1970 and graduated in 1974.
Now, as I'm sure you know, this was a time period when there was a push on the part of the federal government and state governments to diversify higher
Hmm.
education, particularly medical school. And I think it's fair to say that probably the one case that's most famous for creating divisions within American society about diversity was the Bakke case, right,
Correct.
out of California.
Hmm.
And for those of you who aren't familiar, Mr. Bakke was a white male who a couple of times applied to medical schools in California and didn't get in. And then he eventually filed a lawsuit claiming that he was more qualified than some students of color. In other words, African American students who had been admitted to California medical schools.
Hmm.
And it really sparked, gosh, a multi decade fight over admissions. But I think one of the unfortunate side effects of Bakke's challenge and a lot of the rhetoric concerning diversity was an automatic attack on the competence of black physicians and also the assumption that you weren't qualified to be there. Now,
Hmm.
to take this back to your life, you're obviously an accomplished man, very smart, great credentials. What was it like for you as first a black medical student and then a black physician? Did you ever encounter some of the issues that black doctors talk about in terms of maybe some white patients being reluctant to have you treat them or maybe colleagues questioning your competence?
Uh, I didn't encounter a lot of that. I had a lot of uncertainty about my competence. I had a lot of I had a fair amount of imposter syndrome. I was a fat kid who was immensely insecure. And, Lord knows the armor that came from my parents, the armor that said the world is full of enemies, was helpful or would have been helpful in those encounters. But I don't think that I was more viewed with more suspicion than other clumsy medical students at Harvard Medical School. Um, there was kind of an unspoken agreement uh, that patients ascribed to when they came to those teaching hospitals, Boston City, Beth Israel, Mass General, that they were going to be cared for by a squadron of people. The professor was world famous and you'd see him briefly, but there was a whole battalion of much less expert people that you had to put up with as a patient.
Let's turn to the book now. And I'd like to read a portion of the book. It's a note to the reader. Right from the beginning, you just really touched me and so many of the other people. I can tell you, we've already had an unofficial book club meeting, the members of my text group about your book. But listeners, I want you to pay careful attention to these words. This is Dr. Yorke with a note to the reader. Quote, I felt the impulse to write this book as I faced the black study shelves of our local bookstore. It began as a letter to our sons. I marveled at the indisputable truth in those books, the scholastic rigor, pages brimming with courage, trauma, and righteous fury. Their diagnosis of America's racial illness was brilliant, the prognosis bleak. But I found little mention of treatment and wondered where my story could find shelf space. I felt dwarfed by the forces they described, felt as powerless as any viewer of cable news. If these authors held the whole truth, my life hadn't amounted to much. There was more to be said, value to be added. So this book started off as a letter to your sons.
Sure did. Sure did.
Right.
Yeah,
Tell us about that.
I wanted to talk about who their dad had been. I wanted to talk about things that happen that don't come up at family reunions or Thanksgiving dinners, parts of the past that hurt. And I was writing that letter and feeling like I'm doing a good job. Then Mary and I find ourselves in a long line to get into the Black Smithsonian Museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, DC. So we're shuffling forward. and I see dimly some words that are etched over the entrance. And as I get closer, I see that they're words from James Baldwin. And what they say is the great force of history is that it lives within us, controls us unconsciously.
Mm.
So I look at that and I'm moving forward and I decide, there's a lot of people in this line, but the only person that guy's talking to is me. Those words are directed specifically at me because I am not as conscious of my past as I could be.
Mm.
So I rethought this, and the letter's getting longer now. It's getting longer. And as I'm working to get close to what hurts, I think of some lines from uh, a guy named T.S. Eliot, who was he writes some really obscure poems, but this last poem called Four Quartets is his best. He thought it was his best. He was born in St. Louis and worked as an air raid warden during the Blitz. And that's when he wrote this poem. But the lines are, this is the use of memory for liberation, not less of love, but the expanding of love beyond desire and feeling craving for that. And so liberation from the future as well as the past. So I thought, I want to address my cravings. I want to think about, what I feared, what I craved, and get close to that and maybe get a hint of freedom from it. So this is becoming a really long letter at this point. I mean, it's up to now a manuscript. It's like 50,000 words. And it was at that moment that I got in front of the Black Study shelf. And I thought, maybe I can expand, I can stretch this shelf an inch and maybe tell a Black story that hasn't been told very often. Maybe expand the audience for what we call Black studies.
What was your writing practice like? Did you write daily, weekly?
I wrote probably 5 times a week. I wrote longhand. The first couple drafts were longhand. I definitely wrote with my ears. Every word that you see in the book has been spoken aloud by me multiple times. And I was writing for cadence, writing for rhythm. I wanted very much the fancy words, the Harvard words, to dance nicely with the common words. I'm no poet, but I really respect the economy that poets have with respect to the language. And I'm a big fan of Mark Twain when he said that the right word is lightning and the almost right word is a lightning bug. And I was aiming to have a lot of right words. And I'll say this too, reliably at 4 o'clock each morning, I would wake up and understand, damn, this word isn't right. This sentence belongs somewhere else. This paragraph needs to change. To the point that I had a stack of 3x5 cards by my bed, and I would literally sit up and write myself a note to change it. So that was the process. That was the process.
How long did it take you to write the book?
Oh, a couple years probably. I mean, a lot more thinking than writing.
Now, in the book, one of the major themes is the price of success.
Yeah.
You explore that a lot.
Mhm.
Could you expand on that for the listeners?
Well, like I've said, if you don't have a childhood, that's a price.
Mm.
If you go through life, as a young man at least, understanding that you're in a world that's teeming with enemies, uh, that's a price. Uh, if your ancestors occupy a large volume of your headspace, that's a price. The you know I thought that those were prices of success.
Achievement culture has both positive and frankly toxic effects within the African American community. So let's say now you are an African American mother or a father. You're in your 30s and you have a child and you read Steep. And obviously, you want your child to have the success that you've had, but you don't want them to feel like they've had to pay that price.
Uh,
What are some of the lessons that you would like for the parents to take from that? And then the follow up question is, let's say you're that 14 or 15-year-old who maybe wants to pursue writing or maybe the arts, but you're feeling pressure from your parents to live out the American dream and go to the reliable professions, medicine and law. So, what lessons do you have for that parent and for that child?
uh, I'm not sure that I have a takeaway from this book. There isn't a clear takeaway. I'll tell a little story about our younger son, who's among the most creative people I've ever met. He's 15 years old, and he doesn't have the desperation that I had as a 15-year-old. He's a child of affluence. And I'm getting in his face about getting his homework done and, getting on the right path. And he comes up to me, gets about 12 inches away from me. And at 15, he's bigger than me. He's probably 6'4". And he says quietly, he says, "Dad, do not tell me what to do. Tell me what you did."
Mm.
And that encounter has stayed with me ever since. And it was with me as I started writing. Uh, so I guess Steep is an invitation to wake up, to be woke, if you will, to
Mm.
the past and to your past, and to leaven your desperation, if you're a parent, with the wisdom of the long view. I think it's very important that folks contribute something to the tribe, contribute something useful. Um, but I don't know. I think that my upbringing was excessive. The achievement was excessive too, in a way. I overachieved for sure. But I guess I just advise the parents to to look at their own past, look hard at it, and understand. Hmm, I don't know. I'll just quit. I'm not sure I've got the words.
Well, I think that maybe leads to the next question then, because that's a difficult question. It really is. I think that one of the reasons, again, why I love the book so much is because I think it is a book that I would encourage parents to read with their children starting around eighth or ninth grade, because no such book existed when I was coming up at that age. And I endeavor to say that there probably wasn't a book that you had either.
Yeah,
A book that really forces parents and children to talk about success
yeah,
and achievement and why we're doing certain things. Who are we trying to please?
yeah,
And I really like to what you said about being present.
yeah,
So much, I think, of the unhappiness that a lot of African American professionals feel is there's this sense of emptiness once they get to the promised land, because the promised land first was admission to a prestigious
yeah,
institution. You get there and then you realize, okay, I'm here, but now it's what's next and what's
yeah,
next. And when you're constantly living this life of achievement,
mhm,
you don't really focus, I think, on other things like community, healthy relationships, and your own mental,
yeah,
and physical health.
yeah,
So, with that in mind, let's imagine now we're probably not too far off from this being a realistic possibility given the advances of AI and technology. But let's say that suddenly Jeff Bezos and a couple of the other tech billionaires announce in the next month that you can go back in time. And they've read your book, they love it, and they tell you, you know what? We're going to give you the opportunity to go back to that young
mhm,
Craig Yorke
mhm,
in Roxbury, and you
mhm,
can spend an hour with him.
mhm.
What would you tell him?
Uh, I would tell him to press on toward the goal. And the reason I would is that if you change one thing, you change everything. Uh, the exception to that, I guess, would be look into meditating. Look into meditating because if you meditate and you take it seriously, one effect that it has is you find yourself able to relax and focus simultaneously. And that would have been valuable to me as a surgeon. I was a good surgeon, but I would have been better had I been a meditator. Same thing with the violin, you know. But I would tell that young kid that steep as adjective is not the end of the story. That steeping later in life is the more important journey. That your resume virtues are important, but as David Brooks says, your obituary virtues are probably more important.
Amen to that. Two final questions for you. And again, I thank you for the time. I know you've been doing a lot of interviews, and I this is such an honor. You have to understand when I first started this off, I thought that this would always just be a solo podcast. So I was so excited when I got the email, and the fact that you've taken the time is such a
Oh,
blessing today. So, two final questions for you. The cover of the book, and folks, I'm going to use the cover of the book as a thumbnail for this podcast episode, but the cover, based upon my discussions with you, Dr. Yorke, has special meaning. Can you explain to us what the cover means?
steep?
Yes.
Yeah, it is potent for me. It's a reproduction of a pen and ink drawing done by a guy named Ramon Cajal. Cajal was born 100 miles south of Madrid, about 1858. He was an impossible kid. He was attacking the neighbors' houses. No one would apprentice him. All he wanted to do was draw. So his dad, who was the local doc, said, Ramon, let's go somewhere where you can draw. So he took him to the morgue, and Ramon started drawing. A little later, the Spanish army drafted him and sent him to Cuba to fight a colonial war. He got malaria, came back, but he took his notebooks. Anyway, he became an anatomist. He was kind of at the fringe of the academic establishment in science, which was then in Germany and England in the last decades of the 19th century, 1880, 1890. But what he had was the ability to draw, a passion for anatomy, a good microscope for the time, and the ability to stain tissues, to see things that maybe others didn't see. I don't know how this happened, but he got an invitation to speak at the Royal Society, the kind of epicenter of scientific power in London. And he got up in front of everybody and said, you know, all of you gentlemen are wrong about the brain, every single one of you. The brain is not an infinite network of fibers. It's composed of many, many, many individual cells. Our microscopes are too weak to show that, but the structure of the brain convinces me that's true. I believe it. He said, we can't photograph what we see under the microscope. We don't have that technology, but I have a number of drawings for you guys to look at uh, that will show that I'm right. Furthermore, these cells communicate with each other electrically. I can't prove that either, but the structure convinces me. And finally, the structure of old brain cells is different from young brain cells. And I believe that that change is the result of learning. Now, usually what happens next in this situation is that the established scientists laugh the upstart out of the room, and he dies in obscurity and is proven right decades later. But what happened that day was that Cajal basically killed the room. There was tremendous excitement. His ideas were adopted pretty much on the spot. Uh, the whole field of neuroscience was born because of these drawings. And 2 years later, he became the only anatomist ever to win the Nobel Prize in Medicine.
Mm.
His ideas about separate cells were confirmed by electron microscopy in the 1960s. His ideas about electrical transmission were proven right in the 1920s. And his ideas about the structural correlate of learning were proven right just in the last decade or so. So it's an amazing it's amazing evidence of the power of art to give birth to science. It's an amazing example of resilience, of coming from left field to be central. Uh, and that doesn't even talk about what this particular cell does. There are 15 million of them at the base of every human brain, like pages in a book. And what they do is regulate our muscle tone. These cells enable us to stand and walk, to hold a cup of coffee, to write a note. They enable the muscles of our eyes to read. So please don't judge the book by the cover, because the cover sets an unbelievable bar for what's inside.
Well, I found what's inside fascinating because, as I've said before, and you and we chatted before we had this interview today, what really moved me about the book was I like the idea of you saying it's never too late to tell your story, and your story will have value for you and for other people.
Yeah.
And that, for me, in addition to all of the other things we've explored during this interview, just made it such an incredible read. It really, truly is. I mean that. It's in my pantheon of three.
Oh,
When I talk about that in memoirs, I really, truly do mean that. And speaking of books, I told you that I had two questions left for you, so this is the final
yeah.
one. What are you reading now, or what have you read recently that you would recommend to anyone?
I just finished a book by Doris Kearns Goodwin,
Mm.
who actually was, believe it or not, she was my graduate TA when I was a freshman in college, American history. She wrote a book about her love affair with a guy named Goodwin, Richard Goodwin, who was the speechwriter for John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. And just what used to be called presidential rhetoric, I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe the speed of the response to the massacre in Selma. You know, the time from that event to the passage of the Civil Rights Bill was unbelievable. And here's a bit of history that just leaves me shaking my head. Um, Medicare passes. I mean, they passed all these bills, amazing, in 1965. And they're ready to sign the bill in the Oval Office. And Johnson says, we shouldn't do this here because the first guy to think of this was Harry Truman. So let's get on a plane to Independence, Missouri. So the whole entourage gets on a plane and flies to Independence, and they sign Medicare into law in Harry Truman's living room and present the first two Medicare cards to Harry and his wife. I mean,
Wow,
th-
that's
think,
incredible.
think about that. I mean, in the light of presidential narcissism and just all of the stuff that's going on today, and of course, Johnson was in many ways a very unattractive dude, but that book is unbelievable. It's just, I thought, an amazing book.
I will definitely have to check that out. Do you mind if I make a recommendation too? You've probably already read it.
Yeah.
The novel James by Percival Everett.
Yep. Yep. And
Oh,
and his previous book, Erasure.
oh, Dr. Yorke, I knew you were amazing. Now you are officially absolutely eternally amazing. For I should have known that you've read both of those books. No, that's I love both of those books. And so Dr. Yorke, thank you for joining me, and I hope, truly sincerely hope that you'll allow me from time to time when I read a book to maybe shoot you an email and
Yeah.
see whether or not you've read it.
Yeah.
Again, folks, the title of the book is Steep: A Black Neurosurgeon's Journey, written by Dr. Craig Yorke, a man who hasn't just lived an incredible life. I think he's taught us an important lesson that we have within us a story, a story that can help not only ourselves, but others. And we really need to think about the price of success and understand that maybe one of the more important things that you will do in life is define that term for yourself and not let others define it for you. Dr. Yorke, thank you so much for joining us for this first edition of the Trey's Table Podcast Book Club. Thank you so much. And trust me, Dr. Yorke, I can tell you I'm going to publish this probably in the next 24 hours. And after it's published, you're going to be getting an email from my mother. So if you get something from a woman named Dorothy Smith, just know that it is in fact her. And I
All
know
right.
that she's going to love this. And thank you so much for taking the time, Dr. Yorke.
My honor. My honor. Thanks to you, buddy.
Thank you.
Tell your story.
Absolutely. All right. So now let me hit. I need to figure out. I'm good on Zoom, but I need to figure out how to hit the end record button. And there we go.